This video is sponsored by Skillshare. Hey, welcome to 12-tone. Four-chord loops are one of the most common devices in modern popular music, but for a long time, music theorists didn't really know why. I mean, we weren't completely lost. Traditional approaches to harmony could explain a lot of individual loops, but those approaches were designed for a different kind of music, and it showed. But that's been changing in recent years, with new models popping up that actually engage with the four-chord loop on its own terms, trying to understand how it works instead of forcing it to fit into a system where it doesn't really belong. Probably the most ambitious and comprehensive of these is Dr. Philip Tagg's, which he describes in his book Everyday Tonality. It's a fascinating model, and I already made a video about it, link in the description, but ever since then I haven't been able to stop thinking about it, and eventually I realized that the way I was thinking about it wasn't quite the way Tagg described it, so today I thought I'd take a break from telling you about other people's models and do some theorizing of my own. Let's break some ground. To start with though, I should probably explain Tagg's model for those of you who missed the first video. Basically, he takes the four chords in the loop and assigns each of them a function. The first one is the tonic, then you have the outgoing, medial, and incoming. The names outgoing and incoming are pretty self-explanatory, but as for the other two, the tonic is basically your home base. In traditional terms, it's the one chord. The medial, on the other hand, is the furthest point away from the tonic. It serves as a secondary harmonic location. You can think of the loop like a seesaw alternating between the comfortable tonic and the adventurous medial. In his book though, Tagg doesn't go into too much detail about how exactly these functions behave, and most of the other writing I could find on the model doesn't either. Like in Ethan Hines' blog post, he brings up the chorus of Stevie Wonder's Sir Duke and asks a simple question. What's this chord doing? I mean, the rest of it is just 4-5-1 in the key of B, one of the most common progressions in all of Western music, but the F minor doesn't seem to belong. Classical and jazz theorists would struggle to find a compelling explanation for this chord, but Hine argues that the correct answer is, and I quote, "Who cares, it's the outgoing chord," and that feels unsatisfying to me. Now, to be clear, this isn't meant as a slight against Hine. I have a lot of respect for him, and besides, it's a pretty accurate summary of Tagg's apparent position. And I'm not criticizing Tagg here either. His primary focus with the model is identifying the tonic, and that's an important step. I just think there's room to keep going. Taking someone else's ideas and building on them is how scholarship works, and I hope that if Hine and Tagg find this video, they'll take it in that spirit. So, where would I start? Well, I think the answer here lies not in the chords themselves, but in the transitions. Unlike classical or jazz harmony, chord loops are so short that they don't really need to rely on any long-term dependencies like, say, a key center. Each chord change can stand on its own, and the motion and character of a loop comes largely from the sorts of changes we use. Chord transitions come in all sorts of different varieties, but for our purposes, I think it's best to keep things simple, so I'll just be looking at one question. Does the first chord set up the second one? This is an idea that Tagg discusses in his book, largely in the context of the medial chord. He argues that if the medial chord is approached through strong harmonic motion, it creates a sense of arrival, strengthening its position relative to the tonic and putting the two poles of the loop on more equal footing. So what is strong harmonic motion? Tagg defines two types. A chord can be set up if it's approached by step, or if it's approached by what's called dominant motion, which is where you move up or down by a perfect fifth. For the rest of this video, I'm going to say that if we move in either of these ways, it's a setup, and if we do anything else, it's not. I should note here that while these setups imply some sort of directionality, they're not the same thing as a classical resolution. Those are driven by a pattern of tension and release, so when you hear this, your ears know that the next chord is supposed to be this. Just kidding, that was wrong, but that's my point. You knew it was wrong. You could hear that it was wrong because that's not the behavior this chord is supposed to have. Whereas if I play you this, that's the beginning of a loop called the plagal cascade, but it's also the start of the loop from Britney Spears' Till the World Ends. Until you hear the whole thing, there's nothing about this chord that tells you which one's coming next. In effect, resolutions rely on linear directionality, where this leads to this, whereas setups use circular directionality, where the two chords work in tandem to mark out a path through the loop. Using this concept, we can start to see how different chord functions might have different characteristic behaviors. Like, the outgoing chord is supposed to feel like a departure, not an arrival, so it rarely gets set up. On the other hand, the incoming chord is supposed to bring us in for a landing, so it almost always sets up the tonic. This means that two of our chord transitions are pretty well defined. It's not hard to find loops that break them, but by and large, we usually know what's going to be happening around the tonic. Where loops tend to differ is in their behavior around the medial. Now, we could look at these remaining transitions separately, but I think it's more interesting to consider them together. We started by looking at chords, then we switched to looking at the transition between two chords, so the next step is to look at the chord between two transitions, which kinda sounds like we're just going back to looking at single chords, but we're not. We're actually considering three chord units, like little arcs across the circle of the loop. For each chord, we have to examine its its relationship to both the chord before it and the one after it, and if we do that, we see that they can fall into 4 distinct categories. In the first category, we have chords that don't get set up and don't set anything else up either. I'm going to call these islands. They're effectively separate from the motion of the loop, serving as like a harmonic pit stop that adds color without adding direction. These are almost always outgoing chords, like in the doo-wop changes, because everything else is too important in setting up the ultimate return to the tonic. You do occasionally see islands on the medial, like in the falling thirds progression, which, full disclosure, I thought was what they played in Skyfall until I looked it up while researching this video and found out that it's a bit more complicated. In my defense, the last time I heard that song was almost a decade ago. Anyway, this progression is one of the few loops I know of with a medial island, and it is itself pretty rare. I asked on Twitter, and a follower pointed me to Temper Trap's Sweet Disposition, which does use it, but even there, they're doing a lot of stuff with texture that makes the exact shape of the loop feel less significant. So yeah, medial islands exist, but in my experience, the vast majority of islands are outgoing. The next category is the opposite, where it both sets up the next chord and gets set up by the previous one. I'm going to call these connectors. If islands are pit stops, then connectors are like harmonic highways, shuttling you forward towards your ultimate destination. As you might imagine, these are most common on incoming chords, which we see again in the doo-wop changes. But unlike islands, these show up pretty often on the medial as well, like in the plagal cascade. Why are medial connectors so much more common than medial islands? Not sure, but if I had to guess, I'd say it's because having multiple islands in a row can make it feel like your progression's just moving around randomly, so once you've got an outgoing island, you don't really want to add a medial one right after it, whereas multiple connectors in a row feels orderly and coherent, so having both incoming and medial connectors works fine. Again though, that's just a guess. If you have another answer, let me know in the comments. The third category is when a chord sets up the next one but doesn't get set up. These kick off a chain of connectors pointing us towards an eventual resolution, so I'm going to call them signposts. These obviously don't show up much on the tonic, but they can appear anywhere else in the loop. There's incoming signposts like in the four-chord progression, medial signposts like in the doo-wop changes, and outgoing signposts like in the plagal cascade, and each signpost is paired up with our last chord type, the destination. This is when the chord gets set up and then doesn't set up the next one. Destinations are the most prominent chords in your loop, serving as clear harmonic stopping points that give you a chance to reset your expectations. In fact, while all of these functions are important, I'd argue that the key defining feature of a loop is how many destinations it has and where. Since each destination must be paired with a signpost, that gives us 3 main classes of loop. The first are zero destination loops. These are usually all connectors like the Andalusian cadence, and the lack of a clear start or end helps explain that progression's tonal ambiguity. In rock, we usually treat the highest chord as tonic, but in flamenco, where it comes from, the tonic is usually the lowest chord. You could probably even stabilize on one of the middle ones if you wanted to. Yeah, that works fine. And while they're much rarer, you can find all island loops too. Again, I asked on Twitter and a follower pointed me to the chorus from Wonderwall. Here you get a bit of structure from the repeated C-sharp minor, but the progression still feels floaty and non-directional. Someone else suggested Depeche Mode's Shake the Disease, which is especially interesting because it has no repeated chords, it's just sort of meandering up and down in thirds. Anyway, next we have the single destination loops, which in my experience account for most of the loops. We can divide these further into 3 subcategories based on where the signpost is. First, we have what I'll call the drift loop, where the signpost is right before the destination, leaving you with a long stretch of islands like in the falling thirds progression. Interestingly, most of the drift loops I know of have their destination on the medial, like in Shinedown's Second Chance. Next, we have the cascade loop, where the signpost is right after the destination, like in the plagal cascade. Here you have a long string of connectors that pulls you back to the tonic. The whole thing is like a conveyor belt. As soon as you leave your destination, you're immediately on the way back. And finally, we have the piston loop, where the signpost is directly opposite the destination, like in the doo-wop changes. This gives you an even distribution of functions. You have an island, a signpost, a connector, and a destination, creating a clear, consistent rise and fall as you move through the progression. These feel like the archetypal loop to me. It's far from the only common pattern, but if I were to try and nail down one specific function that defined each chord's default behavior, I'd probably go with something like a piston loop. And it's worth noting that, as we saw in Second Chance, the destination doesn't have to be the tonic. It usually is, but for example, the four-chord progression is a cascade loop that lands on the medial. That's why songs like Other Side are able to flip it around, creating a minor version out of the same chords. I don't know of any loops with a single destination positioned on the incoming or outgoing, but if you do, please let me know. And finally, we have 2 destination loops. There's no islands or connectors here. These loops are all business. For example, in Sitting on the Dock of the Bay, we see that the tonic and medial are both approached by step, and they both leave by third. Here, the 2 chords are functionally equivalent, making it much harder to identify which one is the tonic. We're kinda just shuttling back and forth between G and C with the signposts pointing us along the way. We see a similar pattern in Creep, where each of the transitions is distinct, but we're still left with 2 clear destinations. Here they don't really feel equivalent, but they're equally powerful. Now, if you'd asked me a month ago, I would have told you that 2 destination loops always emphasize the tonic and medial. I mean, sure, it's theoretically possible to set up the incoming and outgoing instead, but how would that even work? How could you stabilize it? And then I made a video about Chop Suey, which does exactly that. It uses some arranging tricks as well as some clever voicings to keep you hearing G minor as the tonic even though it's a signpost, which blows my mind. So yeah, it's possible. Still pretty rare though. I should note here that the functions I've described aren't meant to replace Tagg's functions, they serve a different role. Tagg's functions are positional, they define the chord's location within the metric structure of the loop. My functions, on the other hand, are behavioral. They describe what that chord is doing in its position. In order to really understand a loop, I think you have to combine them. Without both models, I'd never have noticed what was happening with Chop Suey. With all that out of the way, we finally have the vocabulary we need in order to answer our initial question about Sir Duke. As Hines says, the F minor is the outgoing chord, but it's more than that. It's an outgoing signpost in a cascade loop. Its job is to take us away from our comfortable home before gliding down to E and beginning the journey back, which is exactly what it does. Is that all? Well, no. If you really want to fully analyze this, you'd probably have to look at why it's a tritone away from the tonic when these sorts of signposts are usually approached by third, but then you'd have to find a way to break up chord transitions into more than 2 categories, which is beyond the scope of this video. Plus, Sir Duke isn't even really a 4-chord loop. I've been treating it as one for simplicity, but the actual progression is more like this. And that little 2-chord bundle complicates things even further. And there's other unanswered questions here too, like what do we do about songs where a single chord takes on multiple functions, like Sweet Home Alabama? Is this long G a connector, or is it a destination followed by a signpost? Is this weak harmonic motion, or none? I'm not sure. Like Tagg's approach, this isn't meant to be complete. When it comes to analytical models, there's no such thing as complete. There's always room for more questions, more nuance, more exploration. That's what makes music theory fun. If there's anything here that catches your interest, feel free to play around with it and see if you can find your own answers. Trust me, it'll be way more rewarding than anything I can tell you. If you find a loop you like, you'll probably want to record it, and if you don't know how to do that, you should probably check out Skillshare. They've got some great courses on recording, mixing, and mastering right at home, which is pretty important these days. My favorite is a set of classes from Grammy-winning producer Young Guru, where he walks you through his mixing process so you can get your music to sound exactly the way it does in your head. And that's just one of their thousands of courses, including other music stuff like songwriting and lots of different instruments, plus other skills like marketing, productivity, and graphic design that any working musician needs to know these days. If you want to check it out, they're even offering 2 free months of premium access to the first 1,000 people to click the link in the description, and if you like what you see, sticking around is super affordable with plans starting under $10 a month. It's a great deal, and again, it's free for 2 months with the link in the description, so why not give Skillshare a shot? And hey, thanks for watching, thanks to our Patreon patrons for making these videos possible, and extra special thanks to this video's featured patrons, Duck and Howard Levine. If you want to help out and help us pick the next song we analyze too, there's a link to our Patreon on screen now. You can also join our mailing list to find out about new episodes, like, share, comment, subscribe, and above all, keep on rockin'.